Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 2007 horror anthology, Trick or Treat. Now, before I get into sharing my thoughts on the film, I want to give a very special shout out to a longtime subscriber and friend of mine, Jonathan, for sending me this Blu-ray. Thanks, Jonathan. And this is a film that I'd heard about. I'd read about for quite a long time in terms of all the different various reviews and all the critical acclaim, and I just never really got around to watching it. There were other films I wanted to watch more. There were films that I just was more in the mood of seeing or seeing again, so it just fell through the cracks. But since this is the Halloween season, and I've been in the mood to watch more horror anthologies, I decided to finally give this one a watch. And I gotta be honest, I was a little disappointed by it. I'm not gonna say I thought it was bad, or I think it's overrated, or I think it's not a good film. I think it's a good movie. I do think it's one of the better horror films from this particular decade. But the decade of the 2000s to me was kind of weak anyway when it comes to the quality of horror. Um, and I would say it's one of the better horror anthologies that have been released in recent years. I mean, if you compare this to something like Creepshow 3 or Tales from the Hood 2 or the first VHS, it's definitely a lot better than those three horror anthologies. But at the same time, I was a little bit let down by it because, for one, I'm not a big fan of the structure of everything happening all in one night and all the characters being connected and everything being, one big giant puzzle. And I understand why they took that approach. Apparently, Michael Dougherty was a huge fan of Pulp Fiction, and on one hand, I do give it credit for being something different when it comes to the horror anthology, but I guess I just prefer my horror anthologies to be structured in more of a way similar to Creepshow, or something like that, or the Amicus horror films, horror anthology films, where they're separate stories taking place in different settings and with different characters, and there are different characters in this film, but it just seems like the whole interwoven thing kind of felt more like a gimmick to me. I don't even think it was really even necessary for these stories. I think these stories would have held up just fine on their own, or at least some of them. In fact, some of the attempts to make them interconnected actually hurt some of these stories, which I'll get to later. And I don't know. I mean, I appreciate the attempt. It is definitely a much better attempt at making this kind of film the way that it is than something like Creepshow 3 or what they tried to do with Tales of Halloween with the last segment. But at the same time, I can't sit here and say that I loved it. I know a lot of people love that setup. It's a big reason why they really like this film. But I was very indifferent on it and very meh because I'm not really a big fan of that particular storytelling approach in the first place, at least when it comes to an anthology. And I guess it would have worked more if the characters were stronger. See, in Pulp Fiction, from what I remember seeing, what I've heard about, and that's another film I actually haven't seen all the way through, but from what I have read about that film, it seems like that is a much stronger film character-wise. So when you have all these different, storylines that are connected together and are threaded into one quilt, so to speak, it's a much stronger product because of the fact that you don't have shoddy characters or really old threads that are brittle and don't really hold together. And I feel that other than two characters that are just straight up assholes or misers, the film lacks characters that are charismatic or memorable or likable or characters that really resonate. And as a result, the film suffers because there were a lot of segments where you're just like, okay, how are they going to... You're basically watching this segment and be like, okay, how are they going to tie this in to this whole concept of everything happening at once on Halloween night? How are they going to connect that to this particular plot choice? What's going to happen next in terms of what kind of twist are they going to try to pull and try to surprise the audience with? So you're just left with really a lot of just watching. You're just sitting there watching what's going on, but you're not necessarily engaged with it because the characters, for the most part, are not as strong as they could be. Because I mean, I didn't relate to most of the characters in this film, and I feel that was easily one of the things that I felt held this film back the most. The most likable character to me was Sam, and Sam is just a mascot for Halloween. That's really all Sam is. But I like that character the most because the character had some personality. The character was unique, and the design was really imaginative and genuinely cool. And that was something about the film that really stood out to me in a good way. And there's some other effect sequences that I liked, and some other, performances that I thought were noteworthy. But it's just one of those films that if the characters were stronger in these stories, it'd be a much stronger film. For instance, with Creepshow, I mean, my favorite segment in that film is the crate. And it's not for fluffy and for the gore and just for, the shock value. It's because of the characters. It's because of how well written those characters are. So when you have characters that are strong, that are well written, that you can relate to or you can latch onto in some fashion, it makes the horror anthology come alive. It makes these characters feel like real people, and it makes the events seem like they're more than just a comic book. And I understand what the film was trying to go for with this comic book kind of vibe and approach, similar to EC Comics, but not necessarily identical. But I just feel that, if I want that kind of thing or that vibe or I want that experience, I'll just read a comic. And in a comic book, you can get away with that kind of approach to characters because comics are much more reliant upon their visuals, the art, than they are necessarily the story or the characters. When it comes to film, to me, it's much more than just what's on the screen. It goes a lot deeper than that. And speaking of what's on the screen, I think the film is really well shot and well directed by Michael Dougherty. I thought he did a great job with this film. I mean, it's got a really slick look to it. I particularly like the cinematography and the way that the film is lit. The cinematography by Glenn McPherson I thought was really quite nice to look at visually. And what I mean by the lighting is that the film intentionally uses a lot of orange and yellow and fall hues to really emphasize the whole Halloween look, feel, and vibe of the movie. And I think that's definitely a highlight for the film. It's almost like the entire movie is lit by a jack-o'-lantern, and that works in the film's favor. I just feel the screenplay by Michael Dougherty was a little hit and miss. I understand why he's doing the whole Pulp Fiction approach, because he's trying to do something different with the horror anthology, and he's a fan of Pulp Fiction, but like I said earlier, it just doesn't really do that much for me. Um, I felt the film started off really strong in terms of the story. When you don't know what's going on, this woman gets attacked by this mysterious monster, and it's a brutal attack scene where she gets blanketed by a sheet, and then blood sprays everywhere, and then you see her hung up on a wooden stake or cross or whatever, and she's got like this Halloween candy shoved so painfully into her mouth that it's made her mouth stretch like this just really gruesome grin, and that was a really effective opening sequence. But then they start doing their whole connecting everything together, and it just kind of starts to lose me at that point. It seems like it put more effort into making sure that everything was connected than it did with characters and with stronger standalone stories. Um, so it's broken up into these different segments. So you have the opening, then you have Principal, which features this kid named Charlie, who I believe is played by the same fat kid, Brett Kelly, who I think he was in Bad Santa. I'm not 100% sure, though. So he's some fat kid who's a real piece of work, to say the least. He's a jerk. He's smashing pumpkins and just doing all kinds of lame shit on Halloween night, stealing candy, and so on and so forth. He winds up getting approached by his principal, Stephen Wilkins, who lectures him about Halloween and the traditions and whatever. And I will give this segment a lot of props, because this was the most surprising, because then you find out that this guy is just an absolute psychopath, because he had these candies laced with cyanide, and the kid's like puking chocolate everywhere, and the kid dies, and then he's trying to bury the kid's body in his backyard, and all the while trying to get his kid to be preoccupied with something else, so his kid doesn't keep popping up in the window and bugging him. Uh, and this is where the film is the funniest, I would say, is in this segment. Um, I'm just cracking up thinking about this scene. So the principal, who is played by Dylan Baker, who plays Stephen Wilkins, and this is honestly one of his best performances. I thought he did a fantastic job playing this character. This is another one of those characters you love to hate, and the reason why is in a lot of ways due to Dylan's take on this role, and just how he just dived in head first with it. And he's in the process of burying this kid in his backyard, and his son keeps interrupting him, and he tells his son, hey, go watch some Charlie Brown. And then the kid fires back, and he's like, Charlie Brown is an asshole. Oh my. Oh man, I love that scene and that kid's line delivery. And the reason why is because you don't normally hear Charlie Brown an asshole in the same sentence. He's usually known as this really nice kid, and the opposite of being an asshole. So that was hilarious. I really like that scene. And I gotta admit, the twist in the end, when you find out what the jack-o'-lantern is that the kid wanted to do so much with his dad, that was pretty grisly and pretty gruesome and genuinely shocking the first time around. I would say the principal segment was definitely one of the better segments in the film for me. Then you have Halloween School Bus Massacre, where you have these three kids Actually, it's yeah. We have these three kids: Macy, Sarah, Chip, and Schrader. Actually, it's four. So these four kids, they meet this girl named Rhonda who's really into Halloween, and they call her like a weirdo, or I think they actually call her the R word if I remember correctly. Um, and she's this savant who can make like tons of jack-o'-lanterns in like no time. And this is a segment that the setup for the urban legend that the kids are talking about that turns out to be true about these kids that were going to be left for dead in this bus by this bus driver at the whims and at the orders of their parents, because these kids are apparently I think it's insinuated they're like special needs or they're like bad kids. They just say they're bad kids, but you don't really get much detail other than they are bad kids. I think that was honestly one of the things about it, this particular segment, that kind of lost me too, is you have this setup and this structure, but it's just very surface level in terms of the development, and it feels very shallow. Oh, these kids are bad, and they are, they're so bad that they're handcuffed and chained to their seats. What do they do? Like, you never know what they did. You never get an inkling of what they did to be, and some of them seem like they're fine. Like, there's the one kid who eventually decides to escape, and he wants to go home and sends the bus over the ravine. Uh, he doesn't seem like he's that bad of a kid. So I don't know what the whole impetus or the whole emphasis on them being bad is, because you never get to know why they're so bad. Um, is it just because they were misbehaving? Is it just because they were special needs and the parents didn't want to deal with it? I don't know what the whole truth is. So the kids are it seems like they're going to be left behind by the bus driver to die. But then that one kid that I was telling you about, he escapes and tries to drive away, but tragically causes the bus to, fall over the ravine. And okay, they're telling this story. All right, it's mildly creepy. All right, whatever. Where are we going with this? And then they take the girl Rhonda to the ravine, and I'm like, they're gonna prank her. They're gonna screw with her. They're gonna try to scare her. Oh, that's exactly what happens. They scare the kid and dress up like zombies. Oh, what's gonna happen next? Oh, the dead kids from the bus are gonna show up, and they're real, and they're gonna go after the kids who pranked Rhonda. I will give this segment one bit of praise, actually a couple bits of praise. Nice bits of atmosphere and mood, like when the kids show up, out of the marsh and they're all like dirty and demented looking. I'll give it credit for that. Um, and the twist when Rhonda just let them die, admittedly, was something that threw me for a loop. And I thought the performance by the actress who played Rhonda, Samm Todd, I thought she did a good job. But the rest of the kid actors were just very hit and miss for me. Just whatever. Pretty average performances. And I liked how Sam actually, he nods his head in respect towards the decision that Rhonda made. But because to be perfectly honest, I don't know if I would save him either. Like, because if you think about it, if I try to save him, that means that these ghosts are probably going to kill me. Because the moment I open that dang door, they're going to come in, and then everyone's going to die, including myself. These kids are a bunch of douchebags who scared the shit out of me and didn't think of anything about me whatsoever. So fuck them. You consider that cold and mean, but they were being cold and mean. So I don't blame Rhonda for being, self-serving in that particular instance. But I know a lot of people really like this segment, but for me, it just, I don't know. It just had all the scares of a Goosebumps episode. And that's another thing with this film. It's not very scary. Like, even in Creepshow, where even some of the campier, segments, there were still moments of genuine suspense and fear. This, I wasn't scared once by anything in this movie. It was very tame. A lot of ways, I was kind of surprised that they didn't aim for a PG-13 rating, because there definitely is some gore and some violence in this, but the overall tone is very PG-13. It's not very hard. It's not like a hard R in terms of the tone. Um, then you have a Surprise Party. This one dragged forever. You have Lori, who's played by Anna Paquin. You have her friends. Actually, not her friends. Her older sister, and then her friends, and they're all a bunch of bitches. And there's this whole thing about how Lori's a virgin, and they're wanting to go to this party so she can pop her cherry, and she dresses up as as Little Red Riding Hood, and I'm like, there's gonna be werewolves, aren't there? Right? There's gonna be werewolves. Yep, there's werewolves. You find out that she's a werewolf, which I'll give it props for that. That it didn't go the predictable route where, oh, she's hunted by a werewolf. Oh, she thinks it's a lover. She's gonna lose her virginity, but it's actually the wolf. I'm glad they didn't go that route. And this sequence has a really great bit of makeup effects when the werewolves transform on a Halloween night. I thought that was some really impressive makeup effects and animatronics and just a really crazy sequence, and I loved it. I loved that scene. As a guy who loves practical effects, that is something that I absolutely adore. I love it when you see scenes like that. And it was really genuinely surprising when the girls are ripping their flesh off their bones and revealing the werewolf underneath. I thought that was a really nice touch. Although that's not 100% original, because there's been films like Company of the Wolves and other movies that have kind of done similar sort of things. But it was still well done, and it was really effective effects sequence. And it was made even cooler by the use of Marilyn Manson's cover of Sweet Dreams Are Made of This. But that segment, other than the werewolf transformation, I didn't care for it. I thought it was really long. I thought it was boring because I didn't care about any of these characters, including Lori. No offense to Anna Paquin. She did the best that she could with what she had to work with, which really was not much. And then they throw in this vampire, and that was just silly to me. And then it was even more silly when you find out the twist that the vampire isn't really a vampire. It's the principal, who I guess now has another modus operandi, another thing that he likes to do to spend his time on Halloween. Like, it's already effective enough that this guy is a high school principal, but he's also a serial killer on the side. You don't need to have him be a serial killer who, gives kids a tainted candy with cyanide and is like burying bodies in his backyard, trying to, and trying to hide it from his son, but his son is just as fucked up as he is, so why hide anything? But that's a whole other thing entirely. But you already have a good setup with him being a principal and a serial killer. You don't need to have him also be a vampire who's dressing up like he's into bondage and shit, or is going to show up at the party at Eyes Wide Shut, and then have him get killed by werewolves. Like, what even was the point of that? That was just so they could connect him to this werewolf story. That's all that was. It wasn't needed. It was also to show him get his comeuppance or whatever, but I think you could have handled that differently. Maybe Sam could have killed him in some way. I don't really feel that was really a twist that worked. I thought it was terrible. I thought it was a terrible twist. Yes, I didn't see it coming, but the reason why I didn't see it coming is because it was some Scooby-Doo bullshit that didn't really work. I didn't see it coming because I'm like, really? That's what they went with? And I didn't need the vampire to begin with. We already have werewolves. Why? We don't need a fucking vampire who isn't even a real vampire. Um, then you have Sam, which that was my favorite segment out of the entire film. This one deals with Krieg, this old cantankerous guy, Mr. Krieg, played by Brian Cox, who really does a bang-up job playing this role. This guy's another, straight-up asshole kind of character. Kind of reminded me in some ways of E.G. Marshall's character in Creepshow. But just like E.G. Marshall, he's just a spiny, prickly person, but he still has enough personality to make it so you enjoy watching him on screen, dealing with whatever the fear or whatever the horror that he's supposed to deal with. And this segment is a real standout. In a lot of different ways. For one, Brian Cox's performance, and the other is the practical effects and just how you get to see more of Sam. And how, Sam is at first this cute looking, plush doll, really. Walking plush doll. And then, it takes his mask off and he's got like this pumpkin for a head and like sharp teeth and something straight out of your nightmares. And Sam is actually surprisingly brutal for such a little guy. And then you have this ending, which I thought was really charming, where it looks like Sam is about to kill Mr. Krieg, but then, he stabs his sucker onto a candy bar, and then he's like, oh, and he starts eating a candy bar, and then he just lets Mr. Krieg go. And you're like, okay. I guess it's just one of those things where you just better make sure to give Sam some candy on trick or treat, on Halloween, while he's trick or treating, because he's the mascot for Halloween. He's doing all these things. He like kills people and hurts people because they're not following the guidelines and the rules of Halloween. So if you decide to actually follow these rules and give him some candy, then he'll let you live. So for the most part, it seems like Sam doesn't really harm that many people, because most people just follow the rules. And that's something that makes Sam a unique character, other than just Sam's appearance. But, Mr. Krieg was still going to get his, which I was hoping that was still going to happen, because when I was watching this segment unfold, I'm like, they're not going to let him live, right? Because this is the bus driver. So, and speaking of the bus driver, that's another reason why this whole everything's interconnected kind of didn't work for me, because I predicted that he was a bus driver, because that was like one of the only pieces in the puzzle left. So it wasn't very surprising. So what happens is he gets killed by the revenants of these kids that he left behind. He was going to leave to die when the bus crashed into the ravine. And actually was going to leave them to die beforehand. He was just going to give them some candy and just leave them chained up to die and to rot. And they come for him. And that's the end of the movie. And, I get why it ends the way that it does. And that would work fine if they showed you what happens. But they don't, because they ran out of money or for some other aesthetic reason. But, you just see what happens in comic book panels, and that's just not as satisfying. Now, this film is one of those movies that, yes, I was disappointed by it in some ways, but I still had a good time with it. It's only an hour and 20 something minutes long. It goes by at a really good pace. It's quite a rollicking good time. It's a perfect film to pop in your player to watch, around Halloween. And it's well directed by Michael Dougherty. It's got some good performances by different cast members: Brian Cox, Dylan Baker, some good practical effects when they are there. And the score by Douglas Pipes, I thought it was fine. It wasn't anything that I thought was particularly amazing, but it was a decent enough score. I appreciate the old-fashioned approach to it with a lot of piano music and a lot of similar sort of notes that you would have heard in Creepshow, for instance, by John Harrison. But I don't think it's really on the same level of quality as that score. But it was still a solid enough effort. It was well edited by Robert Iveson. And for a $12 million production, it definitely, for the most part, has a lot of that on the screen. In particular with the character of Sam. And the werewolf segment, and so on and so forth. I would love to see a sequel. I would hope with the sequel, though, if the plan is to do another interwoven approach to the storyline, that this time around Dougherty or some other writer would make sure that these characters are stronger as a whole. The strongest characters and the ones that I like the most are essentially the villains of the film. The other characters just didn't really do much for me. Even though Rhonda was someone that I felt for, I still wasn't that big on the character. It was a good performance, but the character just didn't really resonate with me that deeply. It was just a very surface level kind of connection. But I'm glad I saw it. I'm glad I have it. And I would recommend it if you haven't seen it already, especially if you're a fan of horror anthologies. And you're looking for, something that's a little bit different than, Creepshow or some of the other horror anthologies on your playlist. And Sam is just so wonderful. Like, I just love this little guy. Like, I can totally see why people went crazy over, getting plushes of this guy. I'd love to get a plush of this guy myself. Honestly, if it wasn't for Sam in the last segment, I probably wouldn't even, like this movie as much as I do. Sam is what really makes this film special in a lot of different ways. Because without Sam, this really is a pretty disappointing horror anthology if you think about it. But with Sam, it helps elevate the film to a higher level. Not as high as other horror anthologies. For me personally, I mean, it's not one of my favorite horror anthologies, but it's still a film that I enjoy and I did like, and definitely had its fair share of merits, and nice macabre and bits of creepy horror as well as camp in the vein of Creepshow or Tales from the Crypt. Anyway, I don't know what else to say about Trick or Treat, except thanks for watching my review, and as always, I'll see you later. See ya.